can't hear me, please speak up in that. And does anyone here plan to be living in 800 square feet or less in the next couple of years? Okay. Cool. Well, so regardless of if you're on the path to small home living or if you're on the fence, what I want to talk today about is how to design small homes that don't feel like small spaces. So at the risk of preaching to the choir, I'll just go over a few benefits of why one can build a small home. There's some obvious financial benefits. They're less expensive to build. They're smaller, so they have lower utility costs. Being smaller also means they cost less to maintain. Having a smaller building footprint means that you have more outdoor space. And then there's some less tangible benefits as well. When you have a larger home, there's just such a sheer amount of interior and exterior area that it's hard to really spend a lot of time to find really interesting materials and finishes for those surfaces. And with a smaller home, it is much easier to find salvage things or things that aren't pre-manufactured or cheap. And that's a big thing. You have more, you can invest in those things emotionally too, much easier. Another thing about larger homes is that part of the point of having a large home is that you have discrete spaces for each function in the home, and also discrete spaces for each individual. In a smaller home, you can't really do that as much, which I think is actually a plus, because then you have to foster interaction and kind of focus on one or two main spaces. And then lastly, small is inherently sustainable. I think that green, energy efficient building is and green technology is a really important thing, but just before you even think about kind of those things in building, I really urge everyone to think about how to build smaller, because building small doesn't have like a life cycle payback cost. It's just like immediately, you just don't have to pay it, and you can't break small. So we can agree that small is good. So then it's how you go about building a small home. I think one approach, which I would call the technologically oriented approach, is exemplified by this project, which was floating around the internet for the past few years. And it was put together by treehugger.com, an eco website, and it was how to live in a small space. And so their approach was to have a ton of moving partitions and built-ins and things, and they said you could have 8 rooms in 420 square feet. I think the downside of this type of approach is that it's incredibly expensive. They sold this year for like $1 million, which is like $2,400 a square foot. New York real estate prices are obviously different to Portland, but even factoring that in, I'm sure it was insanely expensive. I mean, it's basically a box that's just filled with custom furniture. So on the other end of the spectrum, I think, is tiny homes, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, 80 to 120 square feet. Decidedly lower tech, obviously they cost less. The downside being that, everything is compressed into one space, and you also have one space per step. So I think the big takeaway from looking at these two approaches is that the first approach kind of says you don't really have to change how you're living necessarily. You can kind of let technology make up for the space that you're losing. This approach is changing your lifestyle pretty radically in order to live in the smallest amount of space possible. So that brings us to ADUs, which I think are a really great kind of sweet spot between tiny homes and the 2,300 square foot average home that's being built in the U.S. I think the big difference between these two, between ADUs and tiny houses, is that with ADUs you're trying to have all the parts of a normal house, but within a small home, versus when someone moves into a tiny house, they have psychologically question then is, how do you reduce, and I think we can reduce the scale of housing without sacrificing comfort or utility. And I think that you can do that by better matching the spaces to how people live today. Because I think that what's bloating, the average new home is kind of vestiges of how people used to live. And so here's a few kind of points that we're going to go over specifically today. And the first half is kind of general planning and layout ideas, and then the second half is more kind of ADU as well as specific ideas. So here is your typical floor plan of house that we're all familiar with. So what is the, so the question is, what is the difference between how we live today and, more traditional styles or how we might live today? And I think one big thing is that there's just less formality in how people live today. There's really, the line between formal and casual is really blurred, especially in a place here like Portland.
Everyone's pretty laid back. People aren't, having a formal dining room has less utility. And I think the other thing is that even if there are a multiplicity of spaces in a house, almost always there's going to be one space that people congregate to. Often that's the kitchen table or someplace. I know that in where I grew up, there was a beautiful dining living space, and we never lived in it, and we always lived in like this terrible 70s addition that was on the back with green shag carpeting. And I was always like, that's partly why I'm here today, is the trauma of living in that room. So if you look at a plan like this, you have, for sitting, hanging out areas, you have a den, you have living space, you have a great room, you have an oversized master bedroom so that you have seating there. And then for dining, you have, a formal dining room, you have an island, people are probably watching TV and sitting on the couch too. So consolidating your spaces and focusing on one really awesome space, communal space, instead of kind of trying to address every single scenario. So this is a very dark picture. This is a house that that's being built right now, and that has been a test case for some of the ideas that we've been trying to do as far as small living. And this is actually a house that I'm building for my family, so I'm using them as kind of guinea pigs. But these are all ideas that we have implemented in other ADUs and small house projects. And so, so here on the left-hand side, here on the left, it's basically a one-bedroom, one-bath with a large sleeping loft. So on the left, there's the main bedroom, there's a bathroom, there's a kitchen here, and then there's a staircase up to a loft with shelving and sitting space beneath. Then there's a large open area in the middle, and then an entry and a pantry and utility space on the right. And so this is, compressing all of that communal space into this one central area. So another strategy here is also, instead of having, if you go back to a floor plan like this, the private spaces are all kind of, it's kind of scattered, and the living spaces are all, they're just kind of put together versus, well, we're trying to really kind of distinctly subdivide what are the private spaces, what are the public spaces, and what are the utility spaces. And by doing this, you're also able to take maximum advantage of your roof profile. And this, so here, public spaces, you want to have nice lofty ceilings, and then private spaces, you don't need that so much. And so here we're kind of taking maximum advantage of this peak, and then taking these secondary spaces and pushing them to the sides where ceiling height is not necessarily important, or it's not needed. And so here you have the bedrooms on this end, and then on the lower end, you have a storage loft above. So another idea is reducing circulation space. In a traditional house, there's hallways and other just lots of excess circulation space. And so I think in a small home, what's really important is making spaces work double or triple duty. So in something like this, you have a dining table, which is also doubling as a workspace for the kitchen. And then additionally, you have this kind of buffer seating zone around here. And then additionally, this space is doubled up with, the kitchen work circulation space. And then there's also circulation space through here. You can, in a really large home where you had a ton of people, there might be issues with this. But in an ADU or a smaller home, you have, most of the time, there's just a few people. And if there are more people, you have some intimacy with these people. So here's the upper floor of the same plan. Here on the left, there's a sleeping loft, and then an open space, and then a storage loft on the right. And so there's 3 bunks here on the left-hand side. And the idea with this is that during the day, these sleeping nooks are open to this semi-public space and then open onto the larger public space. And they lend their area and their utility and their light to this space. But then these can also, if you pull a curtain, and then these can be private sleeping spaces. So that's that's a big thing, is reducing. Bedrooms I feel like are kind of a really low-hanging fruit as far as reducing size, because typically, why bedrooms are really large kind of perplexes me sometimes. You sleep there, you change there, you do other private things there, and you don't need like a bunch of sitting area. So here's an ADU plan that kind of takes that idea and applies it to an ADU. So here you have living and dining space with an open kitchen, and then you have a sitting area here underneath a loft. And so let's see. So during the daytime, this is kind of a sitting nook that opens onto this public space, lending the space and the light to it. And then you can have a curtain or a sliding door here that makes this sitting space into a suite where you can have privacy, you can have your closet, you can have your bathroom and your sleeping space, and that's closed off from this main space. Here's a project that I love that we didn't do, that's up in BC, and this is just, I think, a great example of a beautiful small house that has this really interesting kind of alcove plan where you have a main central space that's a vaulted central space, and then you have all of the other functions kind of embedded into alcoves all around that open onto this central space. So another big issue is storage and what to do with all our stuff. And a few points, I find that having a formal, not a formal entry, but a dedicated entryway in a small house is really important, because that's a place where you're going to have tons of jackets and shoes and other things that are really going to clutter up a space. Especially in Portland, you see a lot of bungalows with a double parlor and the door opens right into it, and you're just kind of dumped into this public space. And so I find having a dedicated entry really important in keeping that main space uncluttered and having a little progression where you kind of come into a space before you're dumped into where the party's happening. And another issue is with ADUs, we're limited on square footage. We're limited on footprint and then total square footage. A lot of the times you might have a lot of your storage area within your house, and that can be expensive, just area-wise, but also, whether we don't need to necessarily have all of our storage space. So oftentimes we find that it's really helpful to have either some kind of outdoor shed or some kind of lean-to that is not counted as part of the ADU. This project on the left, this is like a bike garage that was built, at the same time as an ADU, but it was not counted towards the ADU footprint or ADU total space. And then this is a bike garden shed that's full of stuff. Another important thing is how you place the ADU on the site and how it relates to the main house. And obviously there's a million ways that this can be set up, but I think that one really important thing to think about is how that outdoor space is being divvied up between those two buildings. Because so on the right you have kind of an interior courtyard, which I think has a lot of appeal. I think the downside of something like this is who owns this yard, visually and physically is kind of up for grabs. And so if you have a separate tenant or someone that's in this space, even if it's family, it can sometimes become awkward to use this space. You have cross views through here, and then you're just, if someone's using this, then all of a sudden the other person kind of feels potentially hemmed into their space. Whether you have hard fences or not, I think that something vegetative could be nicer. But I think just being aware of orienting views between the ADU and the main house so that you're kind of dividing up the space from the get-go so that you're not having these kind of visual conflicts between those two spaces. Another idea is...
Actually, could you go back to that?
Yeah.
So like in this hypothetical situation on the left, the ADU, the wall that's between, that's on the ADU that's between the yard might have privacy glass or something like that, so they get light, but they don't have to see what's going on in the main yard. And then you might orient the windows and stuff to open up towards the ADU's yard. Is that basically what you're... Yeah,
he asked if there would be privacy glass or something on this side. I think you could do that. Another thing you could do is have, clerestory windows high up, or have, vegetation, or even just, keep the windows and doors to this side so that the view's out this way instead of this way. I think there's a lot of ways to do it. It's just something I think that should really be aware of, because you see spaces like this where no one really feels ownership of it, and they can just, basically no one uses it because no one really feels like comfortable using it. So here's an ADU floor plan, and kind of talking about, getting into the more specifics about, do you do 2 stories or 1 story or something in between? On the right hand here you have, and we're just using an 800 square foot ADU as an example. On the right hand here, you have a full 2 stories. The advantages of doing something like this are there's much less footprint, there's less envelope, so it's probably somewhat cheaper, or a little cheaper and more energy efficient than something like this. A downside of this is that on the upper floor you have the potential for vaulted ceilings and things, but the main living space is probably going to be on the ground floor. So it's harder to take advantage of that in a great way. Another downside of the 2-story scheme is that you have a staircase, which takes up a surprising amount of room in a floor plan like this. You had a question?
Does the city allow for a staircase to be outside, like in the bottom or main garage?
Yeah, you can. The question was if the city allows a staircase on the exterior. And yeah, you could do that. One thing we've run into a lot of the times is ADU sites are often really tight, and that staircase can't be in a setback. So oftentimes you're pushing the building out. If you do have a garage below, I think that can make a lot of sense. So on the left-hand side, you have more foundation, you have more roof, but you're able to. The floor plan is probably a little more efficient because you're not having stairs, and you're also able to vault all your spaces if you want to. The scheme that we mostly go with is something in the middle where you have a loft and a double height open space. And this is always, we feel like this has been really dynamic to have that really tall space. And then also having these multiple kind of more cozy spaces opening up onto a larger space is really successful and dynamic, we found. So Portland has the 18-foot ADU height limit. So this is 18 feet to the middle of the highest roof. And so if you're building a two-story building, oftentimes this becomes a big issue, especially depending on if you have a steep roof pitch, you end up with really, really low, and depending on what your footprint is, really low ceiling heights on the sides and then really tall in the middle, and it can be, you know, where you're ending up having to do dormers and things. So I just wanted to go over a few different ways that we've tried to bring the whole building down in order to maximize ceiling heights. So on the right-hand side is traditional new construction. You have a concrete stem wall with a crawl space, and then you have your floors are joists with a drywall ceiling below. Oftentimes you have roof trusses with a drywall ceiling. So this is kind of, on the left is the assembly structure that we typically use on ADUs. So first that we often do is a slab on grade. And how am I doing on time? So a slab on grade, this is great because it brings the interior floor as close to the ground as possible, which, you know, in ADUs often 6 inches, 18 inches can be really important on how that upper floor space pans out. And so, and then also if you want to have an exposed concrete floor, that's a really easy way to do the flooring that's inexpensive. It can go from inexpensive to really insanely expensive depending on how much you grind it. If you just do a hard trowel it and buff it, it can be pretty cheap. If you diamond polish it, it can be more than a wood floor. But you can also put a wood floor on the slab on grade if you don't like the concrete. So then the next thing is this floor assembly that we use a lot, and it's decking on beams. So instead of having floor joists with plywood and flooring and then drywall below, this is larger wood beams spaced, instead of 16 or 24 inches on center, they're spaced generally 4 feet on center. And then on top of that, it's a 2x6 that has a tongue and groove profile on it. And what you end up with is a floor, here, I don't know if you can see that, but it's a floor where the ceiling below is all the exposed wood of the beams and the underside of the decking. And then on top, on the loft, you can just like sand down that decking and use that as the floor if you want to, or you can add flooring. You know, there's some considerations with this. I mean, it's probably a little bit more expensive, but the main issues are oftentimes that space is used for ducting and electrical and plumbing, and so you have to, if you do something like this, you really have to take into consideration where all that stuff is going to go, because otherwise, when it's being built, the subs will just put it wherever they want and totally screw up your nice wood ceiling.
Can I ask a question real
yeah.
quick? If you were using like a split mini system and not having all the ducting and stuff, this probably would work pretty well.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, you know, and then the electrical and things, you have exposed conduit, like, you know, it's like this type of look. And then the other downside is if you really need a lot of sound isolation between those two levels, you know, oftentimes they'll put in like 3 inches of fiberglass in a typical floor. If you have a loft space, you know, sound is coming up anyway, so it's not really an issue. So I think that they're all things to consider if you try something like this. And then lastly is vaulted roofs. Their modern construction technology makes it really easy to do a vaulted roof, and they really make for an interesting space. Even if they're just done with drywall, I don't think anyone can really argue with a cathedral ceiling. You have more space to heat, but otherwise, I don't see that much of a downside. And so if you're interested in some of these ideas, there's some books that you can, that I think are good for pursuing some of these smaller house ideas. One is The Not So Big House by Sarah Susanka. The book is a little bit dated. Some of the interiors are very 90s. And also some of the plans are, when she says not so big house, she means they're like 2,000, 1,800 square feet houses. They're not like small, but she goes through a lot of these same concepts in more detail and really kind of it just is good about what the fundamentals are of doing a small space, even if her clientele is a little bit more upscale. Another one is In-Laws, Outlaws, and Granny Flats. That just has great nuts and bolts about ADUs and has small spaces. And then last is Tiny Homes by Lloyd Kahn. I don't know if you know Lloyd Kahn, but he's basically from the 70s, and he's come out with a bunch of really amazing coffee table books of incredible homes. And a lot of the stuff kind of veers more towards the shanties than really high-end custom stuff, but there's a lot of interesting ideas. And so just to kind of recap, what is important in doing a small home: consolidation of gathering spaces, reducing bedroom size if possible, streamlining circulation to eliminate hallways or make those hallways do double duty with storage or anything. Less separation of formal and casual. That's going back to consolidating those gathering spaces. Combining functions, your living, dining, and also like bedroom and office functions can often be combined. And then remove non-essential functions from the core. That's very catchy. Taking storage space or anything that doesn't have to be in that ADU envelope, and removing that is a way to maximize what you can develop on your site. And then, having I kind of skipped over this, but having a good connection to the outdoors or having a space that opens onto the outdoors really makes a small space feel much larger. Having a dynamic section, having those lofts and those variations in height, siting your building well, and then using compact construction assemblies. So that's it, and I'll just open up to questions.
Does an ADU do stairways in ADUs have to meet the same standards as stairways in regular size houses?
So the question was if stairways in ADUs have to meet the typical regulations, and the answer is yes. It's usually 3 feet wide, but I've argued with the city and gotten stairways down to shaved a few inches off of that, but generally, yeah, it's the same code.
And then related to that, on the loft bedroom, do you have to have egress windows, or does that stair count as an egress?
So this is, I'll say this. So the question was, in a loft, do you have to have egress windows? And the city, it depends on how you classify that loft. If it's a bedroom, then yes, you do have to have egress windows. If it's an office or not a sleeping space, I could be wrong, but technically no. The other thing is, if you want to have like a ladder access to a loft, that's actually something that Portland doesn't have any provision for in their code, and so they technically don't allow it. If you talk to the city, they say that don't have it be habitable space, and then have access to it some other way. But
but you had the three bunks.
Yes, there were egress windows in that space.
Oh, there were. I mean, we're going to put that couch there, and then maybe sometime in the future.
I mean, that's a legal space. There were other windows in that space that acted as egress windows, but Yeah.
When you're building an ADU, do you tie in the utilities to the existing home, or do you run new utility lines, like new sewer lines, water lines?
It depends. I mean, you can. The question was, if you're building an ADU, do you tie into the existing house, or do you run all new utilities? And you can do either. I mean, sometimes with water, oftentimes it's really expensive to put in a new water meter. It's like $5,000 or $6,000, and so you can often upgrade the existing water meter to the house. But sometimes, based on how it's situated, it doesn't make sense, or your water load is too much. Gas and electric, it's the same thing. Where if like if your panel is big enough, if it's a 200 amp panel, then it can maybe just tap off of it. But it depends on if you're using electric heat, if you're using these things, sometimes it needs its own run. So I think it's really you are allowed to tap off the existing house, whether you can for your situation or whether it makes sense. It's just a case-by-case basis. But
Curious what you felt with water heat in these small units, and a lot of units would be large.
yeah. So the question is how to deal with water heating in small spaces. A direct vent tankless system is usually pretty compact. One issue with tankless systems is they sometimes make noise, and if you're in a small space, that can be an issue. I've often used you can get a water heater that's called a lowboy, and it's like it fits underneath the counter. And so you can get like a 40-gallon tank, which is, it's pretty sufficient for 1 or 2 people. And then you can put that underneath like the kitchen or bathroom counter. And that's lowboy, yeah. Any other? Yes?
Just a quick, going back to the stairs, what is the strategy that you can use to be able to keep that from becoming part of the total living space, the floor area?
With stairs, they only count it one time. So with a stair, you count it on the ground floor, but not on the upper floor. So.
Is there a way to actually take it outside?
Well, that's a good question. There's whether that would be counted as part of the ADU. There's specific building coverage is one definition that they use for how they calculate. My answer is hire an architect. It gets complicated because the city uses several different numbers. They have like a impervious area, they have building coverage, they have footprint, and then they have living area. And so the living area, which is like interior space, is how they generally measure the ADU. But then there's other, you're limited to how much lot coverage you can have, how much accessory building coverage you can have. So I don't think there's a straightforward answer. I'm sorry. You said you had a question too?
Yeah, what kind of energy saving, get off the grid type of features would you incorporate in that?
So the question is what kind of energy savings you incorporate. Passive solar water heating is often something that's a really, it's not super energy intensive as far as the embodied energy in the system. PV, like a photovoltaic array, I think if you have good siting and you can get your roof lines to make it work, I think. But I think with these small spaces, going back to the fact that I don't think it gives you a total pass, but they are inherently more sustainable just by reducing. I mean, the resources and land use, I think, are and the energy cost is just way less for a small space. So, I think.
Blown-in insulation.
Yeah, absolutely. We use blown-in cellulose, and having a really, I think one of the biggest advances in construction technology is just having a really tight building envelope, so that air doesn't go through, and then using modern materials that allow that envelope to breathe. Like in the 80s, they had super tight houses, and then they realized that they were just molding. And so now it's kind of super tight houses version 2, where they're kind of doing it right this time. So, yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
When it comes to the utilities and running the lines, if you're able to tap off an existing house, and the house itself, let's say, in this case it's 3 stories, and the ADU, or whatever the floor would be 2 stories, do those lines have to be, like, say, for the sewer and for the water, do they have to be in the ground, or is there a way for them to not be?
So the question is, if you have a 3-story house and a 2-story ADU, are there ways for the utilities connecting those two to not be in the ground? Well, with water and sewer, I mean, with electrical, maybe. The other ones, definitely not, because they have to be protected below the frost depth so that you're not having burst water sewer lines. Gas, I would be shocked if the gas company let you had a gas line running in air. Yeah. I think that electrical is maybe, you can have an electrical run that goes from the pole to the house, but even then, I think you would bury it in a conduit between the two. Yeah. Yes.
I would love to know your opinion about we're looking at building one, and I'm trying to figure out if it's energy efficient and cost effective to do the split minis because or the heat pumps because they're so much more expensive. But
versus like radiant electric?
Yes.
Or, yeah.
Yeah. Like I've seen a lot of ADUs that have the little cadets, but to me, I've always heard that those are pretty not very energy efficient, but maybe because the space is so small, they were.
Yeah, I mean, the question is in a small space, is a electric mini split heat pump like a really more efficient than radiant electric heating? And I don't have specific numbers. I mean, I don't know what that life cycle cost is because those systems can be $3,000 or $4,000 versus maybe like $500 or less for radiant. As far as the energy efficiency, a lot of these houses, especially if you have the like solar orientation done properly, I think that the electric radiant heat, is sufficient. I think the big thing is, with a mini split, you have air conditioning, but then you also have this big outdoor unit that's making noise, and then you have this register inside, which is, kind of prominent and kind of people find it ugly a lot of the times. But
do you do in-floor heating as a source?
Yeah, we have done that a bunch of times. Although, a lot of the times it is kind of overkill for these really small spaces, but it's also really nice and comfortable. So.